Students, welcome to the second video session for understanding the elements of writing by E.B. White and William Strunk. The first video covered the rules 1 through 3. Today we're going to begin looking at rule 4 through 6. As we look at Rule 4 says, place a comma before a conjunction introducing an independent clause. This is something that you should have studied in elementary. This should be just a simple reminder for you. But here's an example of how this is done. The situation is perilous, comma, but there is still one chance of escape. What we have here is two independent clauses, or also called two simple sentences, on each side of a conjunction. When you have two simple sentences or two independent clauses joined together by a conjunction, you must place a comma before the conjunction. If you leave out the comma, it is considered a run-on sentence, and yes, I will take points off for that. Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. Okay. The exception to this is as follows. Two-part sentences of which the second member is introduced by as in the sense of because, or what that means is when as means the same thing as because, or also introduced by for, or, nor, or while in the sense of, or when those words can mean the same thing as of, and at the same time. Likewise, those sentences require a comma before the conjunction as well. The other exception B is if a dependent clause, now remember, a dependent means it cannot stand alone. It depends on the rest of the sentence in order for it to make sense. If a dependent clause or an introductory phrase requiring to be set off by a comma precedes the second independent clause, no comma is needed after the conjunction. Here's an example. Now, notice the clause says no comma is needed after the conjunction. Typically, in a sentence like this, if you have a dependent clause in the middle of a sentence, you separate that whole dependent clause with a pair of commas. But in this case, if you have a comma, a conjunction, and then a dependent clause, you do not put a pair of commas. You only put one comma at the end of that dependent clause after the conjunction. Here's the example. The situation is perilous, comma, independent clause, conjunction, dependent clause, if we are prepared to act promptly, comma. There is still one chance of escape. Okay, technically, if this part was not attached to an independent clause, you would have a pair of commas. But if you will notice, we have an independent clause, simple sentence, could stand alone. We have the comma, the conjunction, and then we have our dependent clause with only one comma, and then the rest of our sentence to finish out. Exception to the rule C. When the subject is the same for both clauses and is expressed only once, a comma is useful if the connective is but. When the connective is and, the comma should be omitted if the relation between the two statements is close or immediate. Okay, here are examples to both C and D, so pay attention carefully. I have heard the arguments, but, and because we are using the conjunction but, we must have a comma at the very beginning. Even though we do not have a subject on this side of the conjunction, the I is the understood subject, but because we are using the conjunction but, and both of these verbs are using the same subject, you must have a comma. I have heard the arguments, comma, but am still unconvinced. Now, you only do that if the conjunction is but. Here's the second example that refers to exception D. He has had several years' experience and is thoroughly competent. He is the understood subject for the second part of the sentence. However, because we are using the conjunction and, we do not place a comma after the first part of the sentence. Rule 5. Do not join independent clauses with a comma. Okay, now what that simply means is a comma only. Remember, independent clauses are two simple sentences connected. You cannot merely connect them with only a comma. You must have a comma and a conjunction. Here's exception A. If two or more clauses are grammatically complete and are not joined by a conjunction, you must use a semicolon. So it is perfectly permissible to omit the comma and the conjunction if you use a semicolon. And again, this kind of writing is for the expanded writer who is ready to move into a more eloquent and higher level of writing, which I strongly encourage that you are that kind of writer for the big paper that you will write for this class. Mary Shelley's works are entertaining, semicolon. They are full of engaging ideas. Okay, if you will notice, these are two simple sentences connected by a semicolon. The two sentences are very connected and related to each other. And also notice one more thing. You will not begin the second sentence with a capital letter if you use a semicolon. Here's the second example. It is nearly half past 5. We cannot reach town before dark. Again, the two simple sentences are very closely connected. They are joined by a semicolon, and you do not cap the first letter of the second sentence. Exception B to Rule 5. It is equally correct to write each of these as two sentences, replacing the semicolons with periods. Here are the examples. Mary Shelley's works are entertaining. They are full of engaging ideas. It is nearly 5:30. We cannot reach town before dark. Now, if you will notice, it is permissible and it is grammatically correct to use a period, begin the second sentence with a capital letter, and have two short, simple sentences. However, remember, in higher levels of writing, if your paper is full of short, choppy sentences, your paper becomes monotonous and somewhat boring and repetitious sounding. When the two sentences are very closely connected, you need to come up with some form of connecting the two sentences together to convey both ideas related to that point. And you can do this by using the semicolon. There are other ways, of course. You can use the comma conjunction, or you could turn one part of it into a dependent clause. Mary Shelley's works, which are full of engaging ideas, are entertaining. And that would be a way that you could combine the two, turning this part into a dependent clause. If you do that, however, you would have to have commas, a pair of commas that I talked about earlier, a pair of commas separating that dependent clause from the rest of the sentence. Here's how that would sound. Mary Shelley's works, comma, which are full of engaging ideas, comma, are entertaining. Here's the way that we can do this sentence. It is 5:30, comma, and we cannot reach town before dark. Here's another way this can be done, turning this first part into a dependent clause. Because it is nearly 5:30, comma, we cannot reach town before dark. Okay, I've explained this in the several different ways that you can take two short, choppy sentences and combine them to a little bit longer, more meandering style sentences for the purpose of you getting ideas of how to expand your writing structure. By expanding your writing structure, it will make your sentences and your writing more appealing and interesting to the reader. Keep in mind, for all of the papers that you're writing, including the big one, all of the papers that you're writing for my class, I am your reader, and I will be looking for expanded writing styles. Here's another exception, C, to Rule 5. If a conjunction is inserted, the proper mark is a comma before the conjunction. Okay, this should be very simple for you to remember. However, you would be surprised at the students that forget this part, and I have to take points off for having run-on sentences. Mary Shelley's works are entertaining, comma, for they are full of engaging ideas. It is nearly 5:30, comma, and we cannot reach town before dark. Note, if the second clause is preceded by an adverb, such as accordingly, besides, then, therefore, or thus, and not by a conjunction, you must use a semicolon. Here's an example of that. I had never been in the place before, semicolon. Besides, it was dark as a tomb. Okay, these words are adverbs. They are also considered adverbial transition words, which are great for spicing up your paper and adding a little flair to your writing. However, they are not ever to be used as a coordinating conjunction. A coordinating conjunction merely joins two thoughts, ideas, or sentences, or actions. These are not conjunctions, so do not use them as such. They are merely transition words that are adverbs that add flair to your sentence. Therefore, if this is what you are using, you must use the semicolon. Here is an exception to the semicolon rule. A comma is preferable when the clauses are very short and alike in form, or when the tone of the sentence is easy and conversational. Here are some examples. Man proposes, God disposes. The gate swung apart, the bridge fell, and the porculus was drawn up. I hardly knew him, he had changed so much. Here today, gone tomorrow. Okay, if you will notice, these are examples of ways that you can omit the comma and the conjunction or the semicolon. And you can only do that if they are short and they are so connected, and their form and their tone of the sentence is very simple, and it kind of just flows together. Man proposes, God disposes. The gate swung apart, the bridge fell, the porculus was drawn up. I hardly knew him, he had changed so much. Here today, gone tomorrow. Okay, so think about that before you actually utilize that. And again, when in doubt, don't try to use something new. Rule 6, do not break sentences in two, and that is TWO. In other words, do not use periods in place of commas. I met them on the Cunard liner many years ago. Period. Coming home from Liverpool to New York. What's wrong with that? Can you figure it out? One of these is considered a dependent clause and cannot stand alone, but it is written as though it is standing alone as a complete sentence, but it is not a complete sentence. Let me read them again. Listen carefully. I met them on a Cunard liner many years ago. I is your subject. Met is your verb. I met who? Them is your direct object. Therefore, you have a subject, a verb, a direct object, and then you have a complete thought telling where you met them and when you met them, so you have a complete thought. This part stands alone. This is considered an independent clause, a simple sentence that can stand alone. Let's look at the next part. Coming home from Liverpool to New York. Okay, this is not a complete thought. Coming home from Liverpool to New York. Where is your subject? Who was coming home from Liverpool and going to New York? This sentence leaves it out, but it begins with a capital letter and closes this sentence with a period. Even though they are side by side and connected, that this particular subject, I, cannot be transposed to this sentence because you have closed it with a period. You have begun this with a capital letter indicating this one is to stand alone, but it cannot stand alone and lean on this subject because of the closing here and the capital letter here. Again, you should remove the period, place a comma, and make this a lowercase c. And combine this as one entire sentence with a dependent clause at the end of the sentence. Here is another example. See if you can discover which one cannot stand alone. She was an interesting talker. A woman who had traveled all over the world and lived in half a dozen countries. Okay, if you selected the second sentence, you are correct. Yes, I did leave off the period. My bad. I'm so sorry. But a woman who had traveled all over the world and lived in half a dozen countries, what? The thought leaves us hanging. It does not complete the thought. Therefore, this second part, even though it's very long, it's lengthy in words, and it joins two verbs. It has compound verbs connected by the conjunction and, who had traveled and lived are your compound verbs. But it doesn't tell us anything else about the woman. A woman who had traveled all over the world and lived in half a dozen countries. And then it leaves us hanging and dangling with, okay, so what about this woman? Well, the fact is, she was an interesting talker. But we put that sentence all alone by itself with a period, and then we began this with a capital letter, indicating this one is to stand alone as well, but it doesn't have enough content information to stand alone. Be careful of how you set up your sentences. Rule 6 continued. In both of these examples, the first period should be replaced by a comma, and the following word should begin with a small letter, lowercase letter. I've already explained that, so we'll move on. Here is the exception to that rule. It is permissible to make an emphatic word or expression serve as the purpose of a sentence and to punctuate it accordingly. First of all, before we go any further, we need to talk about what is an emphatic word or an emphatic expression. That is a word or an expression that serves to overemphasize or accentuate the original point that you're trying to make. Here is an example. Again and again, he called out, period. No reply, period. Okay, no reply is considered your emphatic, and it's attached as a standalone emphatic thought or expression. I'll give you another example. I searched the entire house and my car, period. No car keys, period. Okay, what was I searching the house for? No car keys. I'm searching for the car keys. I find no car keys in all of my searching. So I turn that section into an emphatic expression. Be very cautious with your emphatics. Make sure that they completely connect to the sentence that is standing alone, that is able to stand alone. I'm going to go ahead and cover Rule 7, even though I said this was going to go through 6. I'm going to go ahead and work through Rule 7 on this particular video. Rule 7 says, use a colon after an independent clause to introduce a list of particulars and a positive, an amplification, or an illustrative quotation. What does that mean? Okay, that means that the colon has more effect than a comma. It has less power to separate than a semicolon, and it is more formality than a dash. Here are some exceptions to this. Follows an independent clause and should not separate a verb from its complement or a preposition from its object. That means a colon follows an independent clause and should not ever separate the verb from its complement, nor should it ever separate a preposition from its object. Let's look at the examples. Your dedicated whittler requires, colon, a knife, a piece of wood, and a back porch. Okay, whittler is our subject. The whittler requires is our verb. So if we say subject verb what, and we get the answer to that, then we have our complement to our verb. So let's try that. Whittler requires what? Here's the answer. A knife, a piece of wood, and a back porch. Okay, because these words complement the verb, they answer the question, Whittler requires what? They are to be connected, because they answer the question what, they are to be connected to that verb, therefore the semicolon must go away. Here's a better way that you can write that if you're wanting to demonstrate you know how to properly use a colon. Yes, there will be times that you definitely need to use a colon. Do it correctly. Here's a better way to write this. Your dedicated whittler requires 3 props. A knife, a piece of wood, and a back porch. Now, we place the semicolon after the word props. Let's go back and evaluate our sentence. Our subject is whittler. That's the who. Our verb is requires. Whittler requires. And our question word is what? And what is the answer to that? Whittler requires what? Props. How many? 3 to be exact. Okay, so Whittler requires what? Props. After the word props, which is the answer to the question what is required, then you can make a list of the items that the Whittler requires, because the word props answers the question. Rule 7 continued. Understanding is that penetrating quality of knowledge that grows from theory, practice, conviction, assertion, error, and humiliation. This is incorrect because from is a preposition, and every preposition always has an object, unless you have written a sentence incorrectly and placed a preposition at the end of a sentence, which you are never to do that. So that's just a little additional piece of information tossed at you today. Now let's go back to our original thought. From is a preposition. From what? And the answer to the what question is theory, practice, conviction, assertion, error, and humiliation. Those words all answer the question from what. Therefore, you cannot separate them from their preposition, because each of these that answer the question what are the objects of the preposition. They are never to be separated with a colon. Here's a more appropriate way of writing that. Understanding is that penetrating quality of knowledge that grows from theory, practice, conviction, assertion, error, and humiliation. No colon at all. Remove it. Join two independent clauses with a colon if the second interprets or amplifies the first. Again, be very careful when you do this. Here's an example. But even so, there was a directness and dispatch about animal burial, colon. There was no stopover in the undertaker's foul parlor, no wreath nor spray. Okay. Here we have two simple sentences. The second part is basically interpreting with an amplified version what is meant by the first part of the sentence. If we don't have the second part, we don't get the full understanding. We don't exactly know what the writer of this sentence was actually meaning until we get to the second part. Therefore, it is permissible to connect these two, and they should be connected in this sense, because this one is the interpretation in the amplified version of what is meant here. So when you have a sentence that is dependent on further interpretation, you need to connect the two sentences with a colon. Here's another exception. A colon may introduce a quotation that supports or contributes to the preceding clause. Now let me pull over and park for just a second and let me say this. In your writing, I do expect you to use direct quotes as you explain the content of information that you're discussing, especially in your research paper part or your literary analysis paper that you write. So make sure that you use a colon if you are introducing a quote that supports or contributes to a preceding clause. Here's the introduction with the quote. The introduction says, "The squalor of the streets reminded her of a line from Oscar Wilde." Colon, open your quotes, capitalize, and state your quote. We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. Period, and then close your quotes. Now, let me also give you another additional piece of information. Every time you use a period with quote marks, every time you use a period or a comma, that period or comma must be placed inside the quote marks, never outside. I see so many students place their period outside the quote marks. I do take points off because that is incorrect. Again, remember, if you're introducing the quote with a complete sentence of explanation or a preceding introduction to that quote, set it off with commas. Now, if you're just using the words, if you make a statement, he felt very strongly about his opinions of being in the gutter. And then if you say, for example, you would just place a comma, because for example is not strong enough of an introduction to use quotes. So make sure that your sentence is a strong introduction to the quote. Exception D. This one should be fairly simple for you. The colon also has certain functions of form, and there are 4 functions that I'm covering here from the text. Number 1, to follow the salutation of a formal letter. Now, a friendly letter just has a comma. If you're writing a letter to a friend or a relative, Dear Aunt Mary, comma. But if you're writing a formal letter, you're going to come down here to this example and you would say, Dear Mr. Montague, colon. If you're writing a college professor, a formal letter, if you're writing for a job application, you're writing a cover letter for your resume, you will want to use a colon. Number 2, to separate the hour from the minute in a notation of time. So if you write the time, the train departs at 10:40. Number 3, to separate the title of a work from its subtitle. Yes, your big paper, you probably will have a title with a subtitle, and that will be your the subtitle will be the explanation of the big title, the main title. Here's an example of that. Practical calligraphy, colon, an introduction to script. Okay, and then number 4, the last one, to separate a Bible chapter from a verse. Some of your writing pieces for history, for literature classes, those of you that are in my American Lit class, you may reference Bible scriptures because so many of our classical pieces used biblical references within the content of the lit piece. So you may need to pull biblical scriptures to reference your writing, and this is how this is done. The book is Mark chapter 11, colon, and then verse 7. It is written Mark 11, colon, 7. Okay, this concludes the second session of videos over the elements of rules of writing. Please replay this as often as you need to. Take notes. Because this is also posted on my YouTube page, you are very welcome to download this onto your own computer or flash drive and have this accessible to you whenever you need it. I hope this section of the elements of writing has been very helpful to you in your writing and your understanding of grammar and writing rules.